A few other big events of 1961. What were the celebrity deaths of 1961? Leo Carrillo, perhaps best known for playing the likable but dim-witted sidekick Pancho on TV's The Cisco Kid. I like this guy. In real life, he was anything but stupid and a man with many talents. The very famous Leo Carrillo State Park in California is named after him. Jeff Chandler, popular actor, died at the age of 42 due to complications during surgery. His best-known role is Cochise in Broken Arrow from 1950. Ty Cobb, the legendary baseball player. Gary Cooper, one of old Hollywood's biggest name actors. Ben Corbett, Western character actor who appeared in no less than 280 films, often as a comedy sidekick. One of his characters was Magpie in Tim McCoy Western movies. Marion Davies, legendary silent film actress. Joan Davis, popular comedian of film, radio, and television. Star of I Married Joan. John Eldridge, actor. This guy was so good he should have been more famous. He had a long career, but rarely broke out of small parts in movies and television. One of my favorite things he did was play the dad on the comedy TV series Meet Corliss Archer, a major role he very much deserved. Harry Gribben, silent movie comedy star. He was very popular at the time, but not very well known now. Why is this? Most of his films have been lost. Dashiell Hammett, one of the greatest mystery writers of all time. He created the characters of Sam Spade, Nick and Nora Charles from his Thin Man series, and the comic strip Secret Agent X9, among other works. Ernest Hemingway, the legendary author, died by suicide. Chico Marx, one of the main three Marx Brothers comedy team. Grandma Moses, the famous painter. Leo Reisman, one of the famous band leaders of the big band era. Gail Russell, popular film and TV actress, died of alcoholism at the too young age of 36. Anna May Wong. She was the first Chinese-American film star in Hollywood and the first to receive international recognition. On January 3rd, President Eisenhower announced that the United States has severed diplomatic and consular relations with Cuba. This is relevant because relations with Cuba were not restored until 2015. John F. Kennedy became the first U.S. president to be inaugurated on color television. This happened on the NBC network, January 20th. Just 5 days after this, JFK became the first president to hold a live, televised presidential press conference. Mel Blanc, the most famous cartoon voice artist who ever lived, was in a terrible car accident on January 24th that left him in a coma for 2 weeks. It happened on the infamous Dead Man's Curve in Los Angeles. Blanc recovered, and it wasn't too long after his coma that he was recording voices in his hospital room. Physically, it would take a bit longer to heal. Blanc was also a popular character actor in shows like the Jack Benny program. He returned to that show for that year's Christmas episode, but had to get around on crutches in a wheelchair. On January 31st, Ham, a chimpanzee, becomes the first great ape to go into space. His mission was a success, and he lived until 1983 at the ripe old age of 25. President Kennedy established the Peace Corps on March 1st. The Barbie doll gets a boyfriend when Ken is introduced on March 11th. It's hard to imagine Barbie without Ken. Long before court TV or anything like it, the very first televised trial was aired in 1961, beginning April 11th. It was the Adolf Eichmann trial, a Holocaust perpetrator. He was ultimately sentenced to hang. The infamous American invasion of Cuba, called the Bay of Pigs, begins on April 17th. It's over by April 19th. It didn't do anything but make Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba, just a little bit madder at the American government. Have you ever heard of TV being called a vast wasteland? Sure you have, somewhere. But you probably never knew who first said it. It happened on May 9th. FCC Chairman Newton N. Minow made a speech about television and the public interest. In this speech, he referred to commercial television programming as a vast wasteland. On July 25th, President Kennedy gives a speech on the Berlin crisis, but the biggest takeaway was his urging of Americans to build fallout shelters. Paranoia about being blasted by nuclear bombs was at a fever pitch, and a lot of people were scared. Construction of the Berlin Wall begins on August 13th. The very first Six Flags amusement park opens up in Arlington, Texas on August 1st. It's called Six Flags Over Texas, and as of 2023 is still in operation. The CTV network was started in Canada on October 1st. This became the country's first privately owned network. Up until then, the only major network in Canada was the CBC, a public broadcaster. Popular comedian Lucille Ball marries Gary Morton on November 19th. It proved to be a much more successful marriage than the one she had with previous co-star Desi Arnaz. American involvement in the Vietnam War officially begins on December 11th. Ireland gets its first national television station, Telefís Éireann, on New Year's Eve. Popular tunes of 1961. The classic era of rock and roll was still putting out great big monster hits. At this point in the 1960s, a lot of songs still sounded like they came from the 1950s. Rock and roll was the dominant form of music. Country was popular, and there were some big country hits, but the genre certainly took a backseat to rock and roll. Blues was becoming a bit better known. It wasn't impossible to get on the charts because Howlin' Wolf and Freddie King did it, but it was very, very hard. Blues music seemed to sell better in album form than in singles. Folk music was starting to creep into popularity, but it had not yet hit its stride. 1961 was a fascinating year for music. It's almost impossible to list every song that came out this year, but what follows are the highlights. The Boys of 1961. Special mention, surf rock is born. Dick Dale is considered the father of surf rock music. In April of 1961, he released what is considered the first surf rock song, Let's Go Trippin'. It was a regional hit in California and a minor hit nationally, but it set things in motion. Soon there would be a lot of super successful surf rock acts like the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean. Even the Ventures started playing a lot of surf music. Dick Dale gets a lot more acclaim now than he did back then, but he still deserves a lot more attention. In November of this year, the Beach Boys released their first single, Surfin'. It was only a regional hit, but it set things in motion for one of the biggest selling and longest lasting rock and roll acts of all time. Elvis Presley. Are You Lonesome Tonight was a song he released in late 1960 that still charted highly in the early part of 1961. His biggest song released in 1961 was the super hit Surrender, backed with the less successful Lonely Man. However, Can't Help Falling in Love, another number one hit, is probably even better known to listeners today. That song was backed with another popular hit, Rock-a-Hula Baby. Elvis had a peculiar single that came out shortly after Surrender. The A-side, Wild in the Country, was the title track of a movie he had made. It did alright on the charts, but was not as successful as the B-side, I Feel So Bad, that did much, much better. He had a double A-side hit single with Marie's the Name, His Latest Flame, on one side and Little Sister on the other. Little Sister is just a great upbeat song. Elvis had two albums this year. The first was the studio album, Something for Everybody. It did very well because, hey, it's Elvis. But one of the albums people know him best for is the soundtrack of Blue Hawaii. The popular title song of the film was released as a single the next year. Ricky Nelson. One of my personal favorite Ricky Nelson songs, Hello Mary Lou, came out this year. It was the flip side to his biggest hit that year, the number one Travelin' Man. He had another single, A Wonder Like You, backed with Ever Lovin', that wasn't quite as successful. He also had an album called Rick is 21. This is the year the name change from Ricky to Rick Nelson started. Odd enough, his first single that year went by Ricky, but this album and the second single went by Rick. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a major Ricky Nelson fan. He always was and will always be Ricky. The whole Rick business doesn't fly with me, and I don't think it really took with anyone, then or now. Most people, his biggest fans mind you, have always referred to him as Ricky. I know he went to Rick to make himself seem more mature and cool, but he didn't need to. Roy Orbison. Elvis Presley and Ricky Nelson are fantastic, that's true. But for pure singing talent alone, there really isn't anyone better than Roy Orbison. 1961 was another good year for him. He had two singles. Running Scared was a number one hit, backed with his little-known cover version of Love Hurts. The latter was originally recorded by the Everly Brothers. It wouldn't be a major hit until 1974 when it was covered by Nazareth, becoming one of that group's biggest songs and a radio staple. Roy's second single was the number 2 hit Crying, backed with another successful song, Candyman. He also had 2 albums this year. Chubby Checker. If you're talking rock music in the early 60s, you've got to talk about Chubby Checker. A lot of people know him for The Twist from 1960, but he had a lot of other hits as well. 1961 saw Chubby release 5 singles and 4 albums. He released yet another album with Bobby Rydell. Pony Time was his biggest hit that year, reaching number 1 on the charts. It was backed with the extremely underrated non-album song Oh Susanna. That was a great song, so overlooked. His other real big singles that year were Let's Twist Again and The Fly. He also did a notable duet with Bobby Rydell of Jingle Bell Rock. The Everly Brothers. Their biggest songs this year were Walk Right Back and Ebony Eyes. They also had some minor hits with Temptation and Don't Blame Me, as well as one album. Bobby V. He had a real big number 1 hit this year with Take Good Care of My Baby. Run to Him was his other major success, but everything he released this year charted. Not bad considering the fact that he had 4 singles and 4 albums. Gary U.S. Bonds. 1961 was a continuation of the success Bonds enjoyed from 1960 with his first big hit, New Orleans. This year he had another big hit with Quarter to Three. Other hits include School Is Out and the lesser hit School Is In. He also had his first album this year. Cliff Richard and the Cliff Richard is just plain big in Britain. He never stopped being big. His popularity will outlive him long after he's gone. He had an amazing 3 albums this year, with one of them being a soundtrack and 7 singles. When the Girl in Your Arms is the Girl in Your Heart, A Girl Like You, Theme for a Dream, and Gee Whiz It's You were the biggest. Amazingly, a cover he did of Ray Charles' famous What I Say flopped. A cover of Chuck Berry's 40 Days didn't do much better. The Shadows, without Cliff Richard, had their first album this year and 5 singles and 2 EPs. All but one of their singles charted this year and were big hits. The hits include FBI, The Frightened City, The Savage, and Kon-Tiki, their biggest hit that year. It took a long time, but FBI became very well known in America as the years went on, due to the fact that so many people covered it. My favorite cover version is the one Mick Ronson played when he was with Ian Hunter's band. This tune should be in action movies. More Boys. Babysittin' Boogie by Buzz Clifford. Barbara Ann by The Regents. This was the original hit version. Jan and Dean recorded it the next year. The most famous version was released by the Beach Boys in 1965. Big Bad John by Jimmy Dean. a #1 country hit. Blue Moon by the Marcels, a #1 hit. This classic doo-wop song for sure sounds like it should be from the 1950s, but it is indeed from 1961. Even more strange, it was a cover of a song that had been recorded as early as 1935. As a matter of fact, there were 2 hit recordings of Blue Moon in 1949. Bristol Stomp by the Dovells, another song that sounds like it should be from the 50s. This is pretty energized, and you can't listen to it without wanting to jump around real crazy like. Calcutta by Lawrence Welk. This #1 hit became the biggest selling recording of Welk's career. It was first released in December of 1960, but hit pay dirt in 1961. It was originally a German pop song from 1958 that had lyrics. Welk's version was an instrumental. It became so hugely popular that many cover versions have been released, almost always instrumental. Even younger people act like The Venture covered this tune. Calendar Girl by Neil Sedaka. Daddy's Home by Shep and the Limelights. Don't Worry by Marty Robbins, a #1 country hit. Gypsy Woman by The Impressions. Hello Walls by Farron Young, a #1 country hit. Hideaway by Freddie King. This upbeat blues instrumental became a standard and has been performed by countless people. Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles, a #1 hit. I Don't Know Why, But I Do by Clarence Frogman Henry. I Don't Want to Cry by Chuck Jackson. I Like It Like That, Part 1 by Chris Kenner. Last Night by the Marquees. The Lion Sleeps Tonight by the Tokens, a #1 hit. A Little Bit of Soap by the Jarmels. Little Boy Sad by Johnny Burnett. Little Egypt, Yin Yang by the Coasters. Getcha. Michael by the Highwaymen. This folk group first released their now famous version of the song in 1960, but it didn't become a #1 hit until 1961. This is still the best known version of Michael Rowed the Boat Ashore. Moody River by Pat Boone. This #1 hit is one of his biggest songs. Mother-in-Law by Ernie K. Doe, a #1 hit. This is a funny but unflattering song about a man's mother-in-law. Odd enough, Ernie K. Doe actually liked his real mother-in-law a great deal. My True Story by the Jive Five. North to Alaska by Johnny Horton, a #1 country hit. On the Rebound by Floyd Kramer. This country pianist had another big hit this year as well with San Antonio Rose. Peppermint Twist Part 1 by Joey D and the Starlighters. Pretty Little Angel Eyes by Curtis Lee. Raindrops by Dee Clark. Red Rooster by Howlin' Wolf. This song became a blues standard and is better known today by the title Little Red Rooster. Runaround Sue by Dion, a #1 hit. He had another big hit this year with The Wanderer. Runaway by Del Shannon, a #1 hit. Shop Around by The Miracles. This #1 hit became Motown's first million seller. It had first been released in the fall of 1960. Stand By Me by Ben E. King. This was a major hit. He was also still enjoying the success of the previous year's Spanish Harlem. Stranger on the Shore by Acker Bilk. This #1 hit was a clarinet instrumental. Sukiyaki by Kyo Sakamoto. The success of this song is peculiar. It's not your standard rock or pop song. It was first released in Japan this year. It ended up topping the charts in a number of countries, but wouldn't hit #1 in America until 1963. This went on to become one of the best-selling singles of all time, selling over 13 million copies worldwide. There were a lot of cover versions of this song in the 1960s. So with the song this successful, the question remains, how come Kyo Sakamoto isn't a bigger name than he is? And why isn't Sukiyaki played more often on the radio? This is one of those really big successes that is nearly in obscurity today. I'm guessing there are at least 10 songs I've mentioned so far that you know better than this one, and although they were hits, they didn't sell like Sukiyaki. Tender Years by George Jones, a #1 country hit. There's a Moon Out Tonight by the Capris. This Time by Troy Shondell. Tossin' and Turnin' by Bobby Lewis. This song was originally released in December of 1960, but it didn't become a #1 hit until July of 1961. This song is so hugely popular that it's hard to believe it took so long to hit. Town Without Pity by Gene Pitney. Turn On Your Love Light by Bobby Bland. Walk On By Leroy Van Dyke, a #1 country hit. Wonderland by Night by Bert Kaempfert. This #1 hit took a long time to be successful. It was recorded in July of 1959. It was released over a year later in August 1960. It took until January of 1961 to strike it big, becoming Bert's first hit. Ya Ya by Lee Dorsey. The Girls of 1961. Patsy Cline. Commercially, this was a good year for the legendary country singer. She didn't have an easy road to success. In 1957, she had one big hit song, Walkin' After Midnight, then zip until 1961. She released a lot of singles between those years, but nothing happened. This year she had two big songs, I Fall to Pieces and Crazy. She also had an album called Showcase. By the way, Crazy was written by future superstar Willie Nelson. Brenda Lee. She became one of the best-selling female artists of the 20th century. This is probably due to her crossover appeal. Brenda's songs could be rockabilly, pop, or country, sometimes all at once. She was able to reach a lot of different people with different musical tastes. Brenda had 4 big hit songs and 2 albums this year. The hits include Emotions, You Can Depend on Me, Dum Dum, and Fool Number 1. Linda Scott. This is probably not a name you're very familiar with. Why? It's a puzzle. 1961 was a good year for her. Her best year, commercially speaking. She had 3 big hits, including her biggest, I've Told Every Little Star, Don't Bet Money Honey, and I Don't Know Why. She did have some more songs that charted through 1965, but nothing as big as these 3. She also had her first album this year. Linda Scott was on TV quite a bit until she retired from show business in 1967. For some reason or another, she is an incredibly undervalued singer of the classic rock and roll era who was, indeed, a big star in her heyday of 1961. It's a shame that her songs aren't played more often on classic rock stations. She deserves to be kept in modern memory. Connie Francis. This was a good year for Connie. Her biggest song this year was Where the Boys Are, but she had others like Breaking in a Brand New Heart, Together, He's My Dreamboat, and When the Boy in Your Arms is the Boy in Your Heart. She also had 7 albums. The Shirelles. When they first released Dedicated to the One I Love in 1959, it didn't sell very well at all. It was re-released in 1961 and became a major hit. Timing is everything. Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow was another odd success for the group. This is another case of a song released in 1960 that didn't hit number 1 until 1961. Other big successes for them this year include Mama Said, Baby It's You, and Big John Ain't You Gonna Marry Me. More girls. Oh, girls, girls, sure do love more girls. At Last by Etta James. Every Beat of My Heart by Gladys Knight and the Pips, their first hit. Gee Whiz, Look at His Eyes by Carla Thomas. Heartbreak USA by Kitty Wells, a #1 country hit. I Know You Don't Love Me No More by Barbara George. I Love How You Love Me by the Paris Sisters, their first and biggest hit. It's Gonna Work Out Fine by Ike and Tina Turner. This became their second million-selling song after their earlier hit, A Fool in Love. It was also their first Grammy nomination. The Mountains High by Dick and Dee Dee. This group is just awesome. Dick is unique in the way that he can sing in a deep voice as well as the real high notes. These two were good together and they recorded a lot of great songs, but this was their biggest. Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes, a #1 hit. There's No Other Like My Baby by the Crystals. This is the debut single from the famous girl group. It did alright, but wasn't a monster big hit. It was also the first release from legendary producer Phil Spector's Phillies Records label. To add to Phil Spector's infamy, he neglected to pay the Crystals for their work on this song.